The next step here is to lay out the position for the mortise and tenons. But before I do that, I'd like to just draw a little illustration to help clarify exactly what we're doing here by positioning the mortise and tenons in place. We've got these pieces, which are 5/8 of an inch thick. Let me draw a picture of a tenon here, which will again help illustrate this. So we've got the tenon here. So this is what our tenon is going to look like. You can see here, this is the width of the stock right here. There's our shoulder, right? Our shoulder goes across the grain. The cheek runs with the grain. But this is what is referred to as a bare-faced tenon. And what I mean by that is it only has a shoulder on one side. The other side, the back side, has just a bare face. It's just perfectly flat. Actually, this is a bare-faced tenon on three sides, on the top and the bottom and the back side. So it's only shouldered on the front. We're going to call this the front right there. There's our shoulder, there's our cheek. Now the top one here, this tenon length is only going to be 1/4 of an inch. It's only going to be 1/4 of an inch in length. Now this bottom one is going to be equidistant, so we'll determine that distance here in just a moment. So far as the width, we know that the overall width of this stock here is 5/8 of an inch. We know that's 5/8 of an inch right there. And then we know that this distance here, well, what we're going to make it is we're going to make it 1/2 of an inch wide. So we're going to make a 1/2 inch mortise there, leaving only 1/8 of an inch for this shoulder right there. Being that the tenons are going to be only shouldered on the front and they're going to be full width, we can actually take this actual piece to determine the width on the actual shelf. I'm going to actually mark the general location for these mortises right now. I want them to be towards the front, and I want to mark it while this is all together. This is important because it's easy to accidentally put a mortise maybe in this location and then in this location if it was taken apart. So if I mark it while it's all together, I'm ensuring that I put the mortises in the correct location. So we're going to put a little mark, maybe just a little X right there in the front right there, one right there and one right there. So mortise, 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 and mortise. Okay? Then we're going to take the width of this stock, which this stock is about 2 inches in width, and we'll take this and just position it right up here. So I'm going to mark right along there and right along there. But you'll notice that mark does not run all the way across. The mortise is just in this front right here. Again, we'll put it over here and we'll mark right up along there and right up along there as well. We'll do the exact same thing on the bottom where these other second set of mortises are going, right there and right there as well. Now we can go ahead and take the shelf apart and begin marking the actual width of the mortises using a mortise gauge. Before we mark the actual position of the mortise with the mortise gauge, I want to clarify something. This top mortise only goes in 1/4 of an inch, so it does not go all the way through. This one, on the other hand, does go all the way through. So these layout lines that I just marked on here, I want to carry those to the other side. Let's do that now. We'll take this and we'll follow this line around to the other side. So we're going to have a mortise in this location, and then again we're going to carry this line around to the other side. Great, now that we've got that, let's go ahead and lay out the actual position of the mortise from the front edge here. Again, we're going to set our mortise gauge to the width of the chisel that we'll be using. In this case, it'll be a 1/2 inch chisel, so we'll set the 2 pins just as we did in the mortise exercise in the 3 joints video series. So we'll set the chisel to the distance between the pins, which is 1/2 inch, and then from the fence to the first movable point, it will be 5/8 of an inch. So let's just use the thickness of the stock. We'll bring that right up just like that, locking it down, and that'll be the measurement. You can also test this too. Whenever I do a mortise, sometimes I like to just pick up a piece of scrap wood, poke 2 points in there, or even move it along, and just see how the chisel falls in between there, making sure that the chisel falls smartly between those lines, right there in between those lines. If it's too wide, well, then we're going to have a problem. If it's too narrow, conversely, there will be a problem as well. Now we're going to mark the width of the mortise using the gauge, and this one is going to be slid all the way up here, just like so. This one here, I'm going to actually put 2 points right in there and then slide it right up to those 2 points. Flip this over and mark between those 2 points as well, stopping at those 2 points. Again, it's helpful to mark lightly. It's oftentimes a temptation to mark too heavy initially. You can always go back and deepen those lines, but mark lightly at first. That'll score the line. You'll be fighting the tool a lot less doing it that way. This one here on the other side is a through mortise. Okay, let's chop some mortises. I'm going to start by working on this top mortise here, and again, remember, it only goes 1/4 of an inch deep. I don't mind if it goes a little bit deeper, 3/8 of an inch. I just want to make sure that it doesn't go 5/8 of an inch. That would be a through mortise. Let's start here. We're going to start a little bit away from the line, and we're going to slowly increase it, just as we did in our mortising video. You remember how we angled the chisel slightly this way, and I'm holding it with the precision grip, primarily because my goal here is not to go very deep. I only want to go a little bit more than 1/4 here. Now, when we get towards the end, you'll notice I've got a little bit of material right there. Now, it's very easy to chunk that out. If that part chunks out, don't worry about it. It's not a problem. It's just a challenge to get to leave it in there. Nobody will ever see it, but if you can leave that in there, it's a good exercise for working in this short grain right here. Let me show you how I accomplish that. As we get closer, the goal is to take a much smaller bite. If I take the chisel straight in like this, I can guarantee that this piece right back here is going to blow out. So what I've got to do is I've got to come at an angle and follow it like this, and then gradually increase the chisel to a vertical stand, just like that. You see how we just slowly work it up, taking off a little bit of material at a time. And now that piece is still intact. Now I'm going to come over here and work this part, again, just as we did, coming in at an angle like this, and again, bringing the chisel up to that vertical position. Now I'm creeping back to the line, and there we have it. We've got that. Maybe just one more hit right there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back with a smaller chisel. A 3/8 chisel will work well. And we'll come back in here, bevel down, and we'll use this like a plane. You see how I'm wiggling it back and forth? Now I want to be careful that I'm not holding it back here, because if I'm just pushing like this, I can also blow through and break that part out there. Come back this way, and clean that out. If you used a small router plane for this, you can actually use that same setting on your router plane to ensure that it is the correct depth. One thing that I like to do is I like to check it with the square to make sure that it is indeed at least 1/4 of an inch. 5/16 is actually better because the tenon length is 1/4 of an inch and I don't want it bottoming out. So I'm just testing it along here. Let's look at that measurement, and it is 5/16 of an inch in depth. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to come back and just clean up the walls just a little bit, just because they're a little fuzzy from working it with the chisel. And that's what we want. So we've got that mortised out, just like that. Let's turn our attention to this lower mortise, which is a through mortise. So we get to go 5/8 of an inch on this one. However, I am going to work from both sides on this one. So we're going to come in, go halfway down, 5/16 down this way, and then go 5/16 up from the other side. So we'll turn it over. So again, it's the same exact technique. We'll start with a 1/2 inch chisel, make a stop cut, angle the chisel in like this. Now, you'll see I'm just going to kind of work this like this. Each time I'm removing the chips. What that does is it enables the chisel to have clearance to be able to go deeper with each subsequent cut. Now this one I'm going to come all the way here to the top. You can see we're going to come all the way through into that dado. So I'll even sometimes score the side right there. Maybe come in with a 3/8 chisel and take that away. Let's come back this way and work this nice and straight. We'll come all the way up to that line. All the way up to that line. There we go. Now we can take the 3/8 chisel, bevel down, and work it just like that. I'm just going to come along with my chisel and just score along the sides, cleaning up any little of those, what I call the fuzzies that are on the side there. Back in with this chisel. And now it's ready to come in from the other side. Before we flip this over to cut the mortise from the other side, I want to do one thing. I want to take my 1/2 inch chisel and I want to make an incision right here at the bottom of the dado. The reason for that is when I'm coming through from the other side, that incision is going to keep this piece of wood right there in the dado from chipping out. So I've made that little knife cut there, the chisel cut, and now we're ready to mortise it from the other side. I'm going to come in here and make 2 stop cuts along the edge. Being that this is a through mortise, I'm going to actually use the method that I introduced there in the video we did on cutting a mortise, where I talk about making a little mini mortise. And that's just a nice way of outlining this outside edge. It keeps that edge from being torn, and it also makes a nice place for the chisel to be able to follow in a nice straight line. Now the pine can be a little bit spongy, so I've got to be careful. I'm holding this more at an angle, especially coming through, because I don't want to break it out. I really want to do more of a cutting action. By holding more of an angle, I'm kind of cutting with the fibers like this, as opposed to just more upright where I'd be forcing the fibers straight down and breaking them. Now I've turned the chisel around, the bevel is facing me, and I'm going to come in like this and work in this direction here. We'll come back here, remove some of this material, and then come back like this. Again, I'm just going to come in here and cut that in just a little. You see how I'm really holding the chisel tight? The reason why is because I'm trying to take off as little material as possible. If I was to hold the chisel loosely and hit this, it could go blowing all the way through and bust something out on the other side. Back in with the 3/8 chisel, we're just going to remove some of that material there. We can even come along with our 1-inch chisel and just slice it along the side and clean it up. You'll notice that there's a little bit of material left in there. That will actually keep the tenon from fitting. So I'm going to clean that up. Again, very carefully, come in like this and angle the chisel back like this. Again, really holding that chisel tight, pinching the chisel, and then coming at it like that. We're going to just clean the side up. You can even take the chisel and run it in there just like this. Run it back and forth, and that'll clean it up nicely. One last thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that this line is in line with this line. And I can do that by putting the square, again, starting from the inside here, and we'll drop it down and make sure. Now you see there's a little bit of a gap right there on the outside. What that's telling me is it's telling me if I was to fit the tenon from this side, coming in like this, that I'd have a gap right out there. And it's also telling me that this is a little bit high right there. So I'm going to take this and chisel that back just slightly. The way I'm going to clean that is by taking the 1/2-inch chisel, taking it, and I know I've got to take a little bit of material off, only as much material as the gap is showing. So we're going to just take this and come in like that. Again, you see how I'm really holding that chisel back? If I let the chisel go, it could blow out the other side and we'd really have a mess on our hands. Now we'll test it again, and you can see that the square is nice and tight right up along that edge. Let's test it on the top. It also is good. Now I can move on to mortising the second side. I'm just finishing up the second side here. We're just cleaning up the edges, making sure it's nice and crisp and clean inside. We'll check it with our square from the inside, making sure that it's good and tight, and I think we're good to go. The next step would be cutting the tenons. So we've got to reassemble the shelf, and then we'll mark and cut the tenons. Now that we've got the shelf fit back together, the next step is to determine which of these we want to be the top and which to be the bottom. I've got this one here that's got a little knot on the end, and I think I'm going to put that towards the top because it's long anyway and I can cut that knot off. Another thing that I want to consider when I position these pieces and mark which one is left and right and top and bottom is the grain orientation. And that is, we know that there's going to be an arch that we're going to cut into this. So if your wood happens to have some sort of arching grain already in the material, configure the piece to match the actual shape so that the grain follows that arch. In other words, right here, there's a very, very subtle arch here. So I would want to put that to where the arch that I cut in follows that grain line. It's especially important if you have a very pronounced grain. You certainly wouldn't want to reverse it. So I'm going to mark this as the top, and I'm going to mark this as the left and the right. And this one here is pretty straight grain. Let's just mark this one. We'll just call it mid, and then we'll call it left and right, middle, and there we go. So I'm going to start here with this left side because I want to cut this off. I'm going to show you how I lay out that tenon just on this one side. So we know that this top tenon is only going to be 1/4 of an inch long, which is, most tenons are usually longer than that, but this is an exercise here that we'll do. 1/4 of an inch long. Again, no need to use a ruler, although you could. I'd just simply get a 1/4 inch chisel and position it right here on the end, and all I'm using the 1/4 inch chisel for is just the length, to determine the length of the actual tenon. So we position it like that, put the little knife mark there, take the square and square that line across. Now it's extremely important, as I've mentioned in previous videos there, that the shoulder is square. That's what's going to determine whether this whole entire piece is square. As you can see, we get a little movement like that, because as I mentioned in the dado video, most of the dados have their strength is down in this direction. So when combined with other joints, as you'll see here with the mortise and tenons, that will give this rigidity, and it will help ensure that this is square. But the squareness comes in here in the shoulders. So make sure that those shoulder lines are perfectly square. So we've got that marked. We're only going to mark one side right now. Now I've got to reset the gauge, and back to our illustration here, we know that this is a bare face tenon, so it's only shoulder on one side. So instead of using the mortise gauge where it has 2 points, we're only going to use the single point right here, and we're going to set that to our 1/2 inch chisel right to the point. 1/2 inch chisel right to the point there. And we're going to scribe this from the back side. Okay, and that will make the actual tenon width 1/2 inch. So you can do this freehand like this. The problem with doing it freehand is that it's easy to get off and move it around, so you can simply put it in the vise and help support the gauge with your left hand and guide it like this. So I'll just take it and run it along like that. Again, just a few strokes there. Now you can see we're going to go ahead and cut that little bit off. That's all we're going to remove, is that little bit. That'll leave us with 1/4 inch this way and 1/2 inch that way. And again, we're only cutting one side. Make your shoulder cut here. And we're only going down 1/8 inch, so it's not very many saw strokes. Make sure that you stop it before you go all the way through. And being that we're removing so little material, oftentimes just use the chisel along the cheek there to just split off the material. You can even set the chisel right in the line and take that right off. I can come across the grain and clean that up. So there we have it. We've got one shoulder complete for the upper piece right here. Let's go ahead and lay out the bottom tenon. Now, the easiest way to measure this one is to position this just like this and make it equidistant. And actually stand it up on edge like this and make sure it's equidistant. That is, it's the correct measurement from side to side. You can even take a ruler to help you measure that. In this case, let's see, it is 3/8 of an inch over there and a little over 7/16. So I've got to actually come back this way, just a smudge there, 7/16 there, and about 7/16 there. Now what I've got to do is I'm going to mark this right up in here. We're going to mark just one side only. We're just going to mark the left side. So I'm going to take the knife on the inside here and just put a little knife mark there. Again, I'm marking the shoulder line on the inside. So there's our knife cut. Now we're going to score that across, marking our shoulder using the square. lightly, then heavier. Put it in the vise. Working from the back side, we'll use the exact same measurement. Make sure we use the single point here and mark it from the back side. Slice it, slide it down. And now we can remove that material. Let's go ahead and cut the shoulder line. So always make your little knife wall cut there, which helps guide the saw. Remember, we're only going 1/8 of an inch deep, so we've got to be careful that we don't go too deep. Now there's two ways to remove this material here. I could chisel it off, but before I chisel it off, I want to inspect the grain. And I can see right here that the grain is clearly making a downward dive. And if I was to chisel that, I could ruin that tenon. So I'm fairly certain that the only way to remove this material is to saw it. I'll put it upright like this in the vise. I can use the dovetail saw and just put it against my thumb, put my thumb there on the side, and saw the cheek off. Listen as you get towards the end, so you don't want to run the saw into the shoulder. You'll hear the tone change, and there it is, right at the end, it's off. Now I want to make sure that it's nice and crisp right there in the corner, and that there's no debris right there in the corner, so we'll just come back with the chisel and clean it up going across the grain. If you work it across the grain, work the chisel across the grain, you don't have to worry about the grain diving down because we're working across those fibers as opposed to with the fibers. Now that we've got the upper one cut and the lower one cut, I'm going to now mark the other side using the scribe method. Okay, so what we're going to do is we want to determine now this distance from inside here to inside there. That's the measurement that's important. Again, of course, I could take out my tape measure and I could try to define that distance. Just take this and say, okay, that is 13 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sixteenths plus maybe a 64th of an inch. And then come over here, you'd go over here and you'd say, okay, that's 13 and 5 sixteenths plus a 64th and mark it. But there's some variation, both in the end of the tape measure and even in our marking, our ability to mark. It's much more accurate to use the scribe method. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually put this right inside here. I'll turn this around so you can see it. There's our tenon shoulder right there. We're going to put it in there nice and tight. Now if you'll notice, I can push this to one side. Now you can see right in there I've got a gap right in there. If I go ahead and mark this other side with that gap in there, then this is going to be loose because that's not an accurate distance from side to side. So what I've got to do is I've got to pull this to where there's no gap right in there. It's nice and tight all the way in there, and we'll use our knife to scribe this other corner. Again, I'm not scribing the entire width of this. I'm just really angling the knife, putting a little mark right there in the corner. Now we're going to do the exact same thing on this lower one. Again, we'll put it down here, making sure that it's good and square and snug in there. Now that we've got both of these marked, we can use our square to scribe that shoulder line. Again, the square is the most important thing here to obtain a perfectly square shoulder. Now you'll notice on this top one, we only have a tenon that's 1/4 of an inch in length, but we've got all this extra material here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 1/4 inch chisel and add to this shoulder line, add to it, put my knife mark there, and scribe it again. See what happens? I pressed too hard with the knife, and the knife actually slid away from the square. So very important, you press very lightly with the knife and then go back heavier. So I've added 1/4 of an inch to my shoulder, and this all is waste, so we're going to cut that off. This is only on the upper one. Now let's go ahead and mark the tenons in the exact same fashion that we did earlier using the marking gauge. Again, from the back side, we'll put this in the vise, defining the width of the tenon, which in this case is 1/2 inch. We'll do the same thing on the lower one as well. This is the lower one that we've marked, the longer tenon. Again, I'm going to mark this right here. Now, if you're using a marking / mortising gauge, it's important that you make sure you use the right end. So I've got the 2 points on this side and the single point on this side. In this case, we're using the single point, so don't make a mistake and flip it over and mark it like this. You want to make sure that you have and use that single point right there. That's the one we set our chisel to. Let's bring that same line down like this. Now we're going to cut the shoulder using the dovetail saw here. You could also use a crosscut saw for this, but I like to use the dovetail saw. The teeth are fine and it cuts just fine. This grain is actually going nice and straight, and I could just chisel away that cheek material right there. So I'm going to come in here starting above the cut and work this in. By starting above the cut, just in case the grain dives down, I'm still safe. But if I take off too much, I can get in trouble. You see here, the grain is actually diving in slightly, so I've got to be very careful. There, it's diving in. So I'm going to actually come across and work it across the grain, and that should save me there. Now we'll cut the shoulder and the cheek on the upper tenon. Now that our tenons are cut, we can actually test fit our shoulders prior to taking the shelf apart. The way you can do that is you can just simply put this in place right here, and it should fit right in between there. And you can see that fits, almost fits. There we go. You can see that the shoulders are now nice and tight right between these 2 points. We can test that as well on the lower one. and that's good and tight. Now we need to fit the actual tenon into the mortise. I'll have to take this apart prior to fitting the tenons into each corresponding mortise. Let's start with these upper mortise and tenons. We know that this one is the right side and this one is the right tenon. So we'll go ahead and position this right in here like this. Now there's two dimensions that this has to fit. It has to fit both in the width and it has to fit in the width in this direction. So we'll call this the height and we'll call this the width. So it's got to fit in the width this way and the height that way. So I'm going to start by fitting it like this. Let's fit the width, and you can see as we fit it in there, it fits nicely. Now if it was too tight, I would either trim the mortise or the tenon. I would look at the mortise first, making sure that the mortise was nice and clean and crisp if it was too tight. And then if it was a little ragged, I'd clean that up. Then if I was happy with the mortise, then I would look at the actual tenon and see how close we were to the line, and you can pair it accordingly. Now that we fit the actual width, now we need to fit the height. So we can fit it like this, again laying this down at an angle like this, and you can see that's going to fit nicely. So now you see by isolating these two dimensions here, we have made it easier to locate any potential problem. Now we can fit the whole thing down in there, and it should fit nicely. There we go, that fits nicely. One thing I'm looking for is to make sure that there's no gap right in there. If this was sticking up like this, there could be two reasons why it would do that. Let's just do a little illustration to help show you what could be the potential problem. So I'm going to draw a tenon on the board here. So here we have it. This is a tenon like this. Well, let's just draw a tenon how it looks. There's our bare face right here, and this is the shoulder. Ideally, we want the shoulder to be perfectly square like this. What can happen sometimes is you can start out square, but then have some ragged junk right there. So when it goes into its mortise, it'll hit right up here, and you'll have a gap right in this area right there. So you need to make sure that this is nice and clean. The other problem, potential problem, is it will bottom out right here. So when it's going into the mortise like this, it'll bottom out here, thus having a gap right there. So that's something that you can check pretty simply by sticking your square inside that mortise, just like this, then taking that measurement. You don't even have to know what that measurement is. You can just take it right here and make sure that that distance is greater than the actual length of the tenon. Now that I'm happy with that one, I'm going to turn my attention to the other one, and the process is exactly the same. We'll start by fitting the width. I'm happy with the width, feels good. Let's check the height. The height seems all right, although I see a little bit that I would like to clean up in there because I don't want to blow that out. So I'm just going to clean up a little bit in the height. Let's fit that in there. Nice. Now I will say pine does have a little bit of a compression factor, so don't worry if it's a little bit too tight. The pine will actually compress slightly. Now that we fit the upper mortise and tenons, let's fit the lower ones. So again, the process is pretty much the same. However, if you remember when we did the through mortise and tenon in the 3 basic joints video series, you'll notice that, you remember that I fit the through mortise and tenon from the outside first. So I start here on the outside, making sure that it fits. Again, let's do it the same way. We're going to fit the width first. Okay, that's a little bit on the tight side. Okay, it's a little bit too tight. Let's check the height. Again, it's a little bit a little bit tight that way. So there's a couple options. I could either clean up the side of the mortise here, or I could clean this tenon. Let's look at the tenon. I can see a little bit of the line left from my marking gauge, so that tells me that I can pare down and still have the integrity of a nice straight tenon. There's also a little bit of a ragged edge right there. So let me start here on the mortise because I don't want to have a ragged edge here. I'm going to take the chisel and just kind of pare it along the side. And then we'll come in, test it again. Just that little bit. Sometimes it just takes the tiniest bit. Now let's check it in the height. Again, that was a little tight as well. There's a couple things we could do. What would actually be easier than actually increasing this distance, because I'd be chopping along this end grain, I should actually take a little bit of material off the bottom of the tenon right there, and that's pretty easily done by just putting it in the vise. I'm going to make a knife line right here and just take a little bit of material off using the chisel and just pare it off. So essentially we made a little shoulder here on the bottom. So we're just going to pare that off right there on the bottom. And now it should fit nicely. That's what we want there. A nice squeaky tight fit. Okay, we'll test it from the other side. Again, that shoulder needs to be to the front. This is the left side. Let's go ahead and fit it in. Now I'm hitting here, so I've got to overhang it off the edge of this board because this is a through tenon. Nice. And that is what we want. Good and tight there on that shoulder and tight all the way around there. I like that. Let me go ahead and take that out and very carefully take that out, and we're going to fit the other side in exactly the same way. And that's it. All the tenons are fit. Now I know that they fit shoulder to shoulder. I know the tenons fit. So I know that the whole shelf should go together. Although I would like to dry fit the whole thing together before I glue it up. But before we glue it up, we need to mark the arches on these pieces, and we need to cut those. We're going to introduce a new tool, which is a spoke shave, which is a lot of fun to use, and I think you'll find many uses for it.